Hello, everybody. It's good to see so many students and faculty, professional colleagues. Hi. It's great to see everybody here. I'm Carl Lestrito. I'm on the Programming and Exhibition Committee with Faye Nixon, Julie Kress, and we're chaired by Catty Dan Zhang. We're charged by the Dean, Jason Young, with a creative and cultural mission on behalf of faculty and students. This semester was the first that saw events and exhibitions under our care, and we're pleased that Marklee is our culminating guest. Recently in our series, we heard Lucy McRae make the argument that the future needs to be designed. Mark Smout, in the gallery talk about his and others' work in the Regional Globalism exhibit, now on view in the Ewing Gallery, cited the notion that the most important learning outcome for a curriculum in architecture, and by extension the most important professional obligation of an architect, is to speculate. I'd like to posit that we'll see work tonight that is resolved, closed, and completed, but that nonetheless provides us all tools to speculate about the future and the past of the discipline of architecture. I consider myself a connoisseur of Marklee's work, and it's truly a pleasure to introduce him. Now, when I say his work, I'm talking, of course, about their work, the work of Johnston Marklee, the practice that he and Sharon Johnston started in 1998. But when I say his work, I'm also referring to his academic contributions to Harvard GSD, where he recently completed his term as chair of the Department of Architecture. I happen to think that being the chair of a Department of Architecture is the best and hardest job in the world. But seriously, I followed Mark in that role because I personally needed models of leadership that deployed humor, cultivated a culture of faculty collaboration, and stewarded institutional legacy that intertwines with the history of a building, specifically a big, bold, concrete building that aims to say something about what it means to study architecture within it. You know the saying, they have the finger on the pulse of something, right? Like Marklee has his figure on the pulse of contemporary architecture, as I've said. But I'd say rather that Marklee has a complete biometric readout of contemporary architecture. Like, he knows its resting heart rate, its BMI, its sleep score, and he knows its appetite for history. In that spirit, I'd venture that their projects, the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago renovation, and the UCLA Graduate Art Studios, for example, are committed to contradiction. And yet, they are abundantly clear. We know that Johnston Marklee believes that a house is a house is a house is a house is a house, because that's the title of a recent book that boldly conflates domesticity with form and scale. They also completed an exhibition, A Grid is a Grid is a Grid is a Grid is a Grid, that likewise insists that the vivid clarity of existence is also a layered rhetorical self-citation. I would say that their work is their work, is their work, is their work, and that for him, a contradiction is a contradiction, is a contradiction, is a contradiction, is a contradiction. Some of Marklee's work was commissioned and cited in Marfa, Texas. I'm mentioning that because many of our students and faculty have connections there. So I want to prove my bona fides as a connoisseur and reference a small project of theirs from 2005 called the Emiriani Studio. It's a bit like a house. It's a straightforward project that elegantly deploys passive cooling strategies and attention to seams and surface. But the roof is magic, seemingly in motion, barely held between and not above the west, north, and east walls. There are two tectonic stories of the house. One is the truth, the other is also the truth. I suspect that Lee's career making complexity coherent has been shaped by in some way by his transnational upbringing in Hong Kong and then in Los Angeles. His academic journey is also influenced by forces orthogonal to each other. I learned in an interview he did for the Harvard Alumni Association that his first two option studios at GSD were taught by Peter Eisenman and then Herzog and de Meuron. Curious. But rather than continue on about what intrigues me, I think I should note that Johnston Marklee's work was featured in exhibitions and the permanent collections of major museums, including the MoMA and the Art Institute of Chicago. And beyond the GSD, Lee has made important impact on many institutions, including Rice Architecture, where he was the Cullinan Chair, and the Frank Gehry International Chair at the University of Toronto. Together with Sharon, Johnston Marklee was the artistic director for the 2017 Architecture Biennial, and it is really a pleasure to be able to pass the reins over to Mark to continue a high-energy day of discourse and discussion. Thank you, Mark, and welcome.
Can you hear me? Oh, great. Thank you, Carl, for the generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Faye. Thank you for the whole group. It's delightful to be here to give a public lecture, because it's always an opportunity to reflect upon one's work when you're not immersed into it. I really appreciate the introduction. I don't think I ever shared why the title of our book or the title of our exhibition is always 5. It came from, obviously, I think, Gertrude Stein's "A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose," which is 4 times. But the first one time is demonstrative. The second is lexical. Third is the word. Fourth is the phenomenon. It evokes the fifth of life as eros. I'm always interested in this evocation of the fifth, of this repetition that suggests something else. So that's why I think in many ways, house is a house is a house is a house is a house is 5 times, and also the 5 orders and Corbusier, just to put it back into architecture. I am intrigued by the theme of this lecture series being focused on the topic of truth. And I try to respond to this, because assuming it's not absolute truth, but relative truth, I do like to frame the work that I would like to show you of the work we've done in the last 25 years or so within this cultural perspective, as opposed to a scientific or a technocratic one. So the first image, I have to summon 2 of my friends. On the left is Austrian writer, journalist Karl Kraus. And the second on the right, you all know his friend and compatriot Adolf Loos, also an architect, but also a writer and a journalist. So together with Schomburg, Wittgenstein, Oskar Kokoschka, that group that really shaped the culture of the turn of the century Vienna. One thing that Karl Kraus brought up was this relationship between the urn and the chamber pot, that he affiliated with his shared sensibility with Loos, in order to define the role of culture, the role of culture plays within a civilization. So the urn on the left is a vessel to contain human remains, or the cremated ashes for burial ceremonies. And the one on the right is the chamber pot, which is a portable night toilet, used in the bedroom before the invention of indoor plumbing. So both of these dates back to antiquity. Both holds human residue, one from the dead, one from the living. One is sacred, the other profane. And Kraus said, I quote, "Adolf Loos and I have done nothing more than to show that the difference between an urn and a chamber pot is this difference, that culture is given the space to play itself out." And I'm fascinated by this notion of between these two, culture exists. And then he said they went on to continue to say that the others are divided between those who use the urn as a chamber pot and those who use the chamber pot as an urn. So this is a question I have. Does this still exist? No? So if we extend this further into design to illustrate this difference that's played out within culture, these are 3 chess sets. The one on the left was designed in 1924. Bauhaus designed. Joseph Hartwig was the designer. The one in the middle was designed in 2000 by Michael Graves for Target. And then the one on the right was designed by designer Karim Rashid, also the year 2000. So, the Joseph Hartwig set was an abstraction of all the chess pieces that we all know, the knights, the rook, the queen, and become this abstracted shapes and a new language, whereas Michael Graves' set is more a caricature of some of the language of the traditional chess sets. And then Karim Rashid completely invented another language, not only for the pieces, but also for the board, so the checkerboards are gone. So why I chose these three sets, because I was thinking about the linguists. Ferdinand de Saussure talked about the difference between deep structure and surface structure, and it's in way of analogy to language, and how he said with chess, like if you change the color of the pieces, if you change their size, if you change the height of the pieces, these are all surface structure. It doesn't affect the deep structure of the game. But if you begin to change the number of pieces, if you begin to change the number of grids, then it changes the deep structure of the game. So he tried to distinguish the differences between deep and surface structures within, let's say, the design of the chess sets. So for me, like a deep structure, like this is a mathematical problem. This is a well-known mathematical problem called the 8-queen problem. It's not a chess game, but then the notion is to how do you place 8 queens on a chessboard, whereas all the squares are covered, but none of the queens threaten each other. So of course this doesn't exist in a chess game because you would not have 8 queens. But I think it's a very interesting moment to use the rules of chess as a way, as a deep structure for a mathematical problem. This is one solution. There are thousands of solutions of how this can be achieved. So just to bring it back into one's work, one has practiced for a series of years, one have done a lot of projects. When you reflect upon these projects, sometimes you see different things or see different dispositions that you might have that you might not be aware of when you started those projects maybe years ago. This is a piece by the English artist Damien Hirst. The title is Isolated Elements Swimming in the Same Direction for the Purpose of Understanding. It's pretty hilarious. They're all dead fish and floating in formaldehyde, all swimming in one direction. I think of them as, and somehow I thought about the traditional avant-garde. All go in one direction, come hell or high water, no matter what. It's the direction that drives one's work. I don't think that exists anymore. Another artwork that I like is, this is a contemporary artist, African-American artist based in Los Angeles. Her name is Kim Dingle. And this piece is a composite painting. This piece is called United Shapes of America. And it's composite maps of the US drawn by Las Vegas teenagers. So this fascinates me, just the size of Florida. This teenager I'm fascinated with. I don't know if they should study architecture, but I think it's a very different moment than everything going in one direction. Everyone has this mnemonic map of this shape of what the US map could be, but the interpretation and the collection of which I think illustrates both the similarities and the differences amongst the individuals and the collective. So I keep on thinking of these moments or these diagrams and thinking about one's own work. We have worked for 25 years thinking about this relationship between the urn and the chamber pot, not to offer an answer or to use our work to illustrate that, but maybe in a way of reflecting the relationship that we have primarily between, I think, architecture and art. The art is something that we have started with, working with artists and the art world that we have. Our first projects are for artists or for the art world. Over time, we have recurring interests besides this adjacent relationship with the art world, which is thinking about art through cultural institutions, how it could affect in an urban scale. I would also say that our interest in history and typology, as well as dealing with existing buildings in terms of conservation and transformation and addition to them. So I'd like to group this series of work that I would like to show as a cross-section over our last 25 years of practice within these figures, and maybe we can look again at this difference between art and architecture. So I think like many Los Angeles practices, we start off with single-family houses. This is really, I would say, not until 20, 25 years ago there were more better public architecture. But the history of Los Angeles architecture, where we're based and founded, were a history of residential architecture. Certainly what when Rainer Banham, when he wrote his book 50 years ago, 54 years ago now, The Four Ecologies of Los Angeles, the city has changed a lot. I would say the physiognomy of the four ecologies are still very present. So when we work on these houses, we always subconsciously think about the four ecologies of the hill, of the beach, of the car, of the plains, and even projects that were not built in Los Angeles, like this one in Rosario, Argentina. We think about like this building on the plains and building in suburbia. This project, by the way, when it was finished, there was a blogger who said this building looks like the love child between Mario Botha and the septic tank. You know, I don't know if your generation finds it funny, but I was really happy. So I think as the scale of the work in our office grew, you know, I think the single-family house was always important for us because that scale, the human scale, was always, we feel very tangible, you know, in the single-family house. And even for projects that are not houses like this photo museum in Shanghai, where really came out from the design for a house for automobiles. So a lot of the scale of this residential work, this is in Kyoto, we're looking at the mariachi window built right in front of a canal. A lot of the scale of these single-family houses begin to inform our work in the commercial realm or larger scale projects, like working from solids to frames, to this project in Miami, which is a retail project built out of a metal frame, to retail projects, office buildings, clinics in Wichita, Kansas. This is a school competition in Argentina, to residential housing that we just started working on in recent years in Miami, in Phoenix, in Nashville, this one outside of Paris. So it's just to give an overview of some of our architectural production over these years. Another aspect is our adjacent relationship with art. The very first project we did was in Marfa, Texas, in the late 90s. You know, a few years after Donald Judd passed away. Some of you might know this is an area in West Texas that Judd moved there in the 60s and began to take over a lot of the buildings and transform them into exhibition spaces for his own work as well as other artists' work, as well as production spaces. So we started off doing, transforming some of these West Texas houses into writers in residency program studios. We also designed some independent freestanding studio buildings. Thank you for remembering that Armiani studio. You know, this is one of the early projects that we've done. We began to work on some of the artists' exhibition projects. We began to design spaces for art production. That was on the left is San Francis Lapis Press. On the right is Canna, an art bookstore. We began to work together with artists on their shows. We had joint exhibitions. We designed exhibitions for museum exhibitions for artists, for live ones, even dead ones like Mahauli Nodge and LACMA. Or the photographer Jim Welling is an artist who we collaborated in many shows. We began to curate some projects. This was for a gallery, for an architecturally themed group show. I want to show this project, because the conceptual artist, Walid Beshti, was so fascinated by Beatrice Colomina's article about the photograph of Charlotte Perrion's with her shadow projected onto the wall, and there was this whole thing about her having to turn her face, but she calculated the same angle and projected a light, and it was so bright that the model here has to turn and then cast a shadow on the wall. On the foreground, there was a carpet that we did with all the Philip Johnston's Mies van der Rohe's furniture, the way that he always placed within his projects, being cut out as a figure. Or installations that we did, and this was in Silent Green in Berlin. I would say maybe the largest this form of curatorial project was as Carl mentioned, the 2017 Chicago Architectural Biennale, where we invited more than 100 architects to do an installation in the former public library building. I mean, it's very hard to do an architecture show because it's always a representation of something else. So what we try to do here is we try to create something that is intrinsically architectural. Scale-wise, you have to look up, you know, like for example, this is an old reading room that we commissioned a group of architects to reimagine the Chicago Tribune competition, you know, but built as a 3-meter tall column. So they're one-to-one scale columns in relationship to the pilasters of the room, but they're also scale models at the same time. So in a way, altogether, they form a peristyle hall that is both a representation of something else as well as something that is one-to-one scale as a column. And then there's another opposite way of looking deeply, like into a diorama, where you forget about everything else. In another one of these large rooms, we invited like 25 architects to each choose a photograph that was important in their work of an interior space and reinterpret that. You know, so some of these, like from radical Italians in the 70s to sometimes a photograph of Malaparte. And then we give each of these architects a base, a dimension of a base to put these installations on. And it's interesting because it's very different from the hall with the columns. You have to look into these spaces, and sometimes when you look in, all you feel is the space and yourself, and you don't feel the surrounding around you. But what we didn't tell the participants is that the configuration of the bases actually collectively formed the first scheme of Mies van der Rohe's IT master plan. You know, so we try to also have a heuristic connection to the history of the place. Adjacent to that room, Asana did this master plan for the south side of Chicago, adjacent to IIT. So that's the relationship. And then the other installations is the Sylvia Levin rebuilding the German Architecture Museum of Matthias Unger's with her story about models, but also rooms actually that you can enter. This is Bauku, the Italian practice, recreating their version of the Giotto's Chapel with a new artist. So a series of installations that happen within this neoclassical building. Frida Escobedo building this space that could be reconfigured over the course of the biennial. But the thing that interests me most are these corridors. You know, when it was transformed from a library to a cultural center, there are a lot of these corridors that are not conductive of exhibition. So we asked a lot of architects to actually do installations within the corridor. You know, so Andrew Zago's piece is so big that when you never really see the entire piece, it takes over your entire field of vision when you're immersed in this type of color scheme that he's trying to illustrate. Or Colombia, Medellin architect Camilo Restrepo did this installation of curtains within another corridor. Paul Anderson did another one with tiles, together with very typical type of installation. This is Caruso Sinjon and Thomas Demann's wallpaper. You know, so these curatorial projects also begin to affect the way that we think about not only how buildings are designed, but also how a collection of buildings are designed. I think besides our professional work and a lot of our academic work, we do a lot of analysis on urban design scale, you know, relationship between buildings. And also some of our buildings, actually like the Menil or Marfa, is really a collection of larger buildings, you know. So some of these are studies of like Hombroek, Erwin Hirisch did in Germany, to Arts Park, to biennials like the Berlin Biennial, a series of buildings, or in New York, you know, Soho in the 80s, the presence of Dia, you know, with Print and Matter bookstore and the Walter de Maria installations that are scattered through a neighborhood. So it's almost like a dispersed museum that begin to reinvigorate and interact with the neighborhood in very different ways. So these type of diagrams we begin to, whenever we work on single buildings, we always think about what are the collection of buildings around that these buildings that we're doing related to. You know, so when we're thinking about Mocha in downtown, when we're thinking about the master plan for Vitra for this next phase, after all these collection of buildings, sometimes they're a larger regional scale, like the MCA in Chicago, how it relates to other institutions, or more local. This is a project in Chicago that we collaborated with Theaster Gates and looking at the buildings that he had renovated. Sometimes there are two layers to buildings. Like this is a study of project that I'll show in Culver City that's really known for the work of Eric Owen Moss. Did these really expressive structures over 20 or 30 years. But at the same time, there are these industrial warehouses that were there. So sometimes the early Eric Moss's work really play off against the banality of these type of warehouses. But the warehouses have their own quality, you know, and that history has to be buttressed too. So our project actually relates much more to this. So as we work on institutional projects like Penn, we look at the institutional work, we also look at the neighborhood work that's there. So how does the building relate to these two layers? Same thing with the Menil. So these type of collective analysis sometimes manifest themselves in projects, or even projects that were not built. This was like the Autos 100, the artist Ai Weiwei, Herzog Daimron. They invited 100 architects to build 100 villas. It's like a big architecture zoo. There's really no context, you know, like it's like these huge villas and they have nothing to do with one another. So it just, for this project, we really thought about the beginning of architecture. We weren't thinking about this is a model in the Kunsthaus Bregenz that Ai Weiwei did, but we're thinking about the double house. You know, at that time, a lot of people were interested in the beginnings, the primitive hut, you know, the gable roof, the very first Adam's house in paradise. So we thought, what comes after the primitive hut? After the primitive hut is built, we thought maybe it's the double house. You know, when the first house is not big enough to contain what it needs to contain, maybe it's the addition of this second part that make it into a double house. It was the first time the house took a step out to become a city. So we have been interested in the idea of this double house. And even though this project never happened, it generated a lot of other collaborations. Like this was a group project in Ansully, in Lake Geneva, in Switzerland, where we designed this 15-unit housing project, or in Rome, where there's some 19th century property with a villa at Grotta Ferrata, where there's some preservation as well as some additions of new buildings that are built, designed out of this variations of reconfigurating a series of white boxes, where they're hinged to form a courtyard-type building, whether they're stacked to form an institutional building, or stacked and extruded to form a series of housing projects. With collaboration, I think the most exciting project or fun project was this pavilion that we did with two other offices in Lisbon in the Triennale a few years back. It's right next to the old 19th century electrical company. This is a new museum by Amanda Levet of Future Systems, and this is our pavilion. The curators invited three offices: us, Office, Kirsten Geers and David van Severen from Brussels, and Nuno Brandão from Portugal, to each collaborate, the three offices to collaborate to design one pavilion. We couldn't figure out a way how to do this pavilion. So at the end, we came up with a formula. I said, why don't we choose, each office would choose 2 rooms from the other practice that we like, just a room, not the whole building. And then we form a collection of these 12 rooms and form the building. So this is a photograph of the plan. So like, these are the 4 rooms that the other office chose of ours. And we aggregate them together without any overlap, without any intersection. So it's really become a collection of buildings, an aggregation of rooms that really didn't exist by itself. And it was a 3-month installation, so everything was built out of studs on the outside and then drywalled on the interior. And all the pieces are reproduction because they can be subject to weather. But what interests me are these rooms that you know very well, in a completely different context, being taken out and juxtaposed within or right adjacent to another room of a very different language. Like this is our vault house on the beach, right next to a room that's more neoclassical, with these columns and these colonnades by office. Or unrealized projects at that time. This was for a room in Chile that was not built, and seeing it in scale. Perhaps trying to take this notion of collaboration further. This was a competition that we lost a year or 2 ago to add on to the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. You know, got to see the Edward Larrabee Bonds Museum here in Knoxville, and this was a project that he built in the 80s and added on. and how we added on to that building, but with a series of language, but we invited 5 architects to work together. So we work on the scheme together. It's a bit like Exquisite Corpse. Everyone does a separate part. We built it out of the same material. We also have interior pieces where one office will be in charge of all the connections, the stairs, the bridges, and these, as well as furniture. So there's an aspect about adding on to older buildings as well as preservation of older buildings, or creating a dialogue with older buildings. This is a project that we are working now in collaboration with Chris Gantenbein in Zurich. There's an old Kunstmuseum on the right, and then to the left is a new addition that they built a few years ago that's connected underground. The old building was designed by Rudolf Chris, a Swiss architect, in collaboration with Paul Bonnartz, the German architect. So already there was this collaboration. So what we're doing is really conserving the old building, but also bringing in new connections, opening up new spaces, but in a very stealthy way. So if you don't know the building before, when you go there for the first time, you didn't realize the connections that we made. We created the bookstore on one side that used to be all closed. We opened up the top where it was not accessible to public for contemporary art to be built there. We opened up this space that makes the building more symmetrical, which is a symmetrical building on the inside, but not on the outside, but not on the interior, as well as reinforcing some of, or repairing some of the gallery spaces, taking it back to the original while performing to today's standards, as well as introducing and adding on to a new sculpture garden to the work. So this project is very stealthy, is much more technical. And some of the others are in smaller scale, but we do add on to that building. Like this is a 2-story building in New York that we added a 3rd story on. This was the former studio of Roy Lichtenstein, and his widow donated it to the Whitney Museum as a permanent home for the Independent Studies program. This is renowned critical studies program that they never had a permanent home for. So when they donated this building, it's partly preserving Roy's studio, but also initiating new interiors for these classes, as well as adding on to a 3rd floor, and how we deal with this interior, this sense of exposed studs with Roy's a framing system on the wall, to dealing with the exterior and building something that is decidedly different from the old building of the 19-teens, but also respecting the cadence of the building. So some of these projects, some of this approach of preserving part of the building is in other projects. This is another project that we collaborated with Fiesta Gates in south of Chicago, where the facade is edited, so it's preserved, but also some windows are blocked back up with some of the bricks that were there. We're adding a totally new interior for a performance center, with a series of rooms that are adjacent to some of these performance spaces that are not programmatically specific, so they can be used for performances or for rehearsals. It's right adjacent to an elevated train, and we extended the roof so it could be used for a book fair or farmer's market. This whole notion of an industrial roof forms a language that it continue to take over the entire site, even before there's built substance as a frame or as a cover. And to go back, I'd like to say something about this notion of the neutral box. Like, is this an urn or is this a chamber pot? Like in LA, a lot of these industrial buildings are background buildings. They're not like public buildings. But as time grows, as a lot of these areas are changing, they're being gentrified, instead of tearing down these buildings, a lot of them are transformed. A lot of our projects are really transforming a lot of these buildings, sometimes for art purposes, sometimes institutional, sometimes commercial. But for us, it's this editing process of how can we take out things that were there, reinsert things that were not there, and create somehow this enigmatic background that these buildings always have. Even an Art Deco building, like can we take out this Art Deco opening, the glass block that were there, and distill it, all the way back down to just the silhouette of this gallery space, or neoclassical banks that were turned into galleries. Sometimes they are stores. Sometimes it's really a tilt-up construction that we added entry stairs and elevators. This is for a car design company. In contrast, I mean, this more, let's say, more closed-off exteriors are oftentimes contrasted with a much lighter interior. Oftentimes when they're gallery spaces, it's really about this adaptability of very different types of shows, different types of medias, but also the importance to have character. The space had to have a certain character. And a lot has to do with proportion and natural light, and also taking what was there and then emphasizing those. Like this is old car dealership and how we focus on the barrel vault as the way that the whole gallery space is centered around. Even extend that to artist studios and production studios. This was part of Lapis Press. And maybe the apotheosis came for this building. Oh, this is, sorry, there was a different building. This is a recent renovation of a building that we have finished in Orange County. And there were 2 existing warehouses that were transformed into a Museum of California art. So what we did, besides renovating those warehouses, we added this open courtyard with this open room that's open to the sky. That is an open space that students could walk through, and it's supported by a series of concrete block volumes. And we also designed a series of markers. We're very influenced by early Frank Gehry projects that has this type of blankness, was captured in a David Hockney painting. We also designed the box where Millett Sheets mural from the 1970s was removed from a bank, being torn down, and then we relocated at this facade facing one of the metro or train stops, and also alluding to some of these old advertising that was in the neighboring industrial buildings. So this becomes like an open box that you can walk through, and then you can enter the museum on both sides. Some of the collections, so this is really not trying to take away from the blankness of these light industrial buildings, but create a series of markers that are more enigmatic. And then, the apotheosis is this building, which is the UCLA Graduate School of Fine Arts. It's a mattress factory from the 40s. Over time, there were other buildings that were built around them like barnacles. So what we did was we preserved those 3 bays of the mattress factory, and we tore down the buildings that were grouped around the building, the original building. And then we begin to study like the Eric Moss pieces, the more expressionist pieces. It really marks the gentrification of this light industrial area, and versus buildings that try to keep that character of these industrial buildings. So how can our building, we see it together with our client and the art students, that it should belong to this grittiness of that old industrial space. So what we did was on the upper right-hand side, we preserved that existing building with the 3 bays, and we added this L-shaped building around it. So this L-shaped building contains 3 courtyards that are covered but not conditioned. And we also build the walls out of tilt-up concrete construction. So this was something that was widely used in the industrial world, but also architects from Irving Gill to Rudolf Schindler in smaller scales also employed this. But basically, you preserve the amount of formwork. It's poured on the ground and then it hoisted back in place. So the code today with this direction or this dimension of the wall requires an insertion of columns between the walls. So we decided to express those columns as round columns, but at the same time, the formwork of the tilt-up panel, we also designed the same way as the columns. So it has this scalloping aspect about it. So there are panels that are poured on the ground, and then there are poured in place concrete columns. So when you look at this, it looks very homogeneous, but when you're there, sometimes you can tell the differences in terms of the concrete colors. Slightly subtle, but you can begin to tell the framework. I think we tried to preserve all the exposed cables, the roughness of that neighborhood, and how things could be cast, the shadows could be casted on the wall. And then there's a few moments where we open up the space, in this case even cantilevering the wall, to create the opening for one of these covered but unconditioned outdoor spaces. So this is more like a hangout, public entry space with landscape. And then the other ones are more used for production. They're always next to the metal shop, next to the ceramic kiln. So production of the artwork could spill out into these spaces. Here you can see, after one of the panels are poured, they're hoisted up and then hoisted in its place before the columns are poured. Here you can see some of the columns are poured, and the far left, some of the formwork are still there. But for us, it's really about repeating something over and over again, and a few things, just like a cornice that would cast a shadow, that you begin to tell the difference or the scale of the formwork. Just the different uses, the different environments within the building for the students, and how something that seems very closed off, there are these moments of transparency that you can see through, that shows you what's happening in there. So sometimes there are these projects that we build and we learn from the projects, but we also try them out in different competitions or different ideas. So this scalloping that we use in the concrete were transformed into a perforated metal for a competition that we were finalists, but we didn't win, lost to OMA, for a performance arts center in UIC, University of Illinois in Chicago. Here you see the 2 volumes. It's basically, one is let's say a ziggurat, and the other is an upside down ziggurat. That's it, connected on the base. Like this picture, because you see in the foreground Walter Netsch's campus, which he designed, which was decidedly different than what he did for IIT campus after Mies van der Rohe, which was respecting Mies's language as a much more brutalist or organic language. You see the School of Architecture. So that was really in response to, here you can see in the background, in between the 2 towers, Walter Netsch's tower also begins to be like slightly upside down a ziggurat. And how that works with the bridge, and then how the perforated metal, through the perforated metal you see these 2 large volumes hovering about. Another competition that we lost. It's really sad to see these things. Sometimes reflection is not very happy. This is for Rice University, for the visual arts program, where if you know Rice campus, was an arts barn, and it's also a gateway of sorts. When you enter the university from the stadium side. Here, instead of the scalloping, we're looking at these kind of triangular shaped scale brick buildings. We're looking a lot at these 19th century Germanic factories, the factory buildings. This stepping, we're looking at Hans Polsek, or this kind of rough factory buildings that are very different from that single-story light industrial buildings in California. I think Ralph Adam Kranz, brickwork, the brickwork of the campus that was done in the 80s of Pelly and that generation, we try to think of using a different form of brickwork for that building. That's in a way different from Michael Malton's building that was built next door. I think in many ways Michael's building was signifying could this quad be more light and modern, and I think we were decidedly having a different position and having this brick building as almost a bookend to Michael's building, but also trying to activate the edge, the space between our building and Michael's building, and creating this work yard and connection to the baseball field, but also how studio activities could spill out into this area in between. I think there's something about these medieval cities that have very intimate scale spaces between buildings that a lot of activities could happen. These are just some images of the interior studios and how we use rough materials like plywood, but also bring out some color into both the structure and the railings and such. This is a project we won, but then the project died during COVID. It was a Philadelphia Contemporary. It's a Kunsthalle. It's a non-collecting museum. It's in the new medical campus that UPenn and Drexel shared. And we're looking at these type of exposed frame, almost like these two-door half timber construction, for the main volume of the building. But what we've created is a series of platforms or what we call tables. On top of these tables are these individual smaller Monopoly-like boxes. And this is an idea that when we won the competition, we were suggesting to Philadelphia Contemporary that during the years before this building was built and before, during fundraising period, you can actually commission these small volumes and occupy them all over the city, collaborate with different institutions, different parts of the city. And when this building is finally finished, these volumes could come back to the mothership. But during these years, Philadelphia Contemporary would have a presence within the city. And then they could be artist projects, they could actually be spaces that are educational. There's a camera obscura in one of them. The director want to use one of them to be a DJ booth, one of them to be harbor spaces for local business nearby. Bring one of the barbecue places to use the one on the ground as an outdoor barbecue. So in a way, it's a bit metabolous. I don't know, maybe there's a stronger frame, and then all these looser elements that's more temporal begins to occupy some of these spaces. So here's this model of this kind of a rough building, with an exposed frame and then a series of platforms that supports these volumes. And the interior is much more museum-like. On the top floor, where natural light comes in, on the lower floor with smaller spaces, exposed steel roof, to the surrounding area, right across from a high school, educational spaces where it extends out to a platform. You see one of the pavilions to the entry hall, where the cross bracing actually become part of the spatial language. So I'd like to conclude with 3 projects. All 3 projects are interventions to museums that were built around a certain period. The first one is Museum of Contemporary Art. It's on Grand Avenue in Los Angeles. It was designed by Arata Isozaki. This is the context of Grand Avenue. 10 years ago, in the 60s, there were Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. Isozaki's building was the first one on the block. This was 1986 when it was built. There was really nothing around it. And when you go there, it's really like a ship on a dry dock, And then if I go back, right across the street, kitty corner, there's the Broad Museum by Dil Scofidio Renfro. Next to it is Frank Gehry's Disney Concert Hall. Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer did the music school. Raphael Menil did the cathedral. Copimo Blau did a school a couple blocks down. So Grand Avenue is finished. Whatever one thing about the quality, it's finished. But it's very different than what Isozaki envisioned in the beginning. So it was very empty. If you see the drawings, like this is what it was in 1986. This is what it is today. So what he anticipated, or the client anticipated, has changed around its surroundings. I like this silk screen that he did when he won the competition in the early 80s. There's this Giorgio di Chirico-esque metaphysical aspect, really long shadows, almost like a building sitting on the desert with these Euclidean forms. And we just did this collage. This is how it is today. And so our proposal, there are 2 phases. One is to take out things that were added on over time, like these 2 things, and then adding on something else, like putting a wall onto that. We're built out of the same red sandstone to define that space. And so when you enter into that space, you know you are in the sculpture called Yard of Mocha. You know you have arrived at Mocha, as well as small interventions to improve the descendants into the museum. And then the second phase is to add new galleries. So we add 2 galleries on top of the existing galleries. So also with the needs of the galleries, but also buttress up the scale to really reinforce the negative space in the middle. It's so hard from an architectural design standpoint to work on this project, because while they are very universal shapes, the cylinder and the barrel vault, the triangle, the pyramid, the cube, it's very idiosyncratic. You cannot do anything any other shape would look, it seems wrong, you know, without copying those shapes. So as we were working on the project, you know, we're working on studying the interior, opening things up, and we finally found a form that we feel pleased with through another Isozaki building. So this is a house that he did around the same period in Venice. There are 2 volumes, and he just cuts the corner to let skylight come into the gallery space. And it seems like a Megaron-shaped house, you know, gable roof house in the front. But it's actually a very and actually, when we tried to duplicate this in areas that we need light, it was strangely convincing. It's almost like tapping into, it's a bit like AI, I don't know, like tapping into the author's own oeuvre to find a language that we can build on top, almost as a vernacular version of how to articulate the outside to really reframe what Isozaki is trying to do in the middle. So here you see some early renderings of finding the same red sandstone that he used. I mean, I think we always, most of the time, we try to imagine if we add on to a building, if someone is going there for the first time, we didn't want ideally we didn't want the addition, that person to be able to tell which is the addition, which is the old one. You know, so it has this, maybe as you look closer, you might be able to, but I think having this totality was important for us. Yeah, so this is the facade. This is how we were thinking of enclosing the courtyard in the middle, how it relates to the density behind, the current density. A second project that we did also a few phases for, but only realized the first, is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. It was built exactly 10 years after Isozaki's Mocha. This is designed by Josep Paul Kleihuis, who modeled this museum. He has this idea of this museum island in Berlin, this type of a raised pedestal and a building sitting on top. Has a certain graciousness, a certain historical aspect about it that's has a very strong profile, but also it was not very well received. This building was very opaque, very unfriendly. There's this obsession with the grid that permeates in the entire building. The response of that, the grid is a response to try to test out where the grid failed. It was also very opaque, very non-transparent. So we did a series of very surgical studies, like these are before and after. Like the building is symmetrical. Why isn't the circulation symmetrical? Why are there a lot of backtracking? You know, so we proposed that strategically adding small things to improve the circulation or closing things off. So a series like this is the first phase that was realized. This was before, this was after. Like we opened up the entire ground floor. We added another floor, the second floor. We added a new stair to connect to the theater. You know, so this used to be a double height space. We put in a new floor, a space for art installation for the ceiling, and how that piece is connected to a new stair. So these are 2 stairs by Kleihuis within the building. You know, this is a kind of football or ship-shaped stairs done in different iterations. So we can't do that by code today. So when we do a new stair, open up a space that wasn't connected before, we took the Kleihuis geometry as a negative, but without directly referencing it. But I think for us, it's almost this repetition different of how you take certain things that were there, and then how you acknowledge that language without directly copying it. So over time, that space was used. This was an artist intervention with a pedestal for a performance. This was a dead-end space, but now you can walk up to upstairs where the cafe is. This notion of third space that is neither an art space nor a lobby space where students or the public could congregate like a living room. Also our collaboration with the artist Crystal Feely, not only on the murals that he did around the building, but also with the colors and the fabric. This is eventually after all the phases are done, the ground base, which used to be opaque, is completely transparent. So the building is retained on top, but it's floating on a much more open socle. There's a third phase for an addition on the opposite side of the building, which we took the same grid of Kleihuis, extending it out with the same proportions, but we wanted a much lighter countenance to the building. So this type of oil canning, that you see, like Frank Gehry used that a lot, that you can see a very light metal cladding. When we looked at the inland steel building of SOMs, it was old pictures was extremely taut. But over the years, there's some light oil canning that makes it very human. When the sun sets, you can see it reflects almost like a wavy form. So we try to do that here to create it's the same rigidness of the grid, so it relates to the old building, but also create a lighter version of how that could be facing the lake. So it has this large atrium that connects to the park, and the park that used to be, or now is like with baseball, but now connect the park back to the museum and eventually to the lake. So the last project I would like to show is the Menil Drawing Institute. It's situated on a 30-acre campus in the Montrose area in Houston. It's known for Renzo Piano's first building in the U.S. Those who haven't been, this is an amazing building. I think it was, he has done a lot more. I mean, my favorite type of Renzo's building are these single-story, or almost single-story buildings. And he has done a lot more, and he has really perfected it. There's Nasher Sculpture Museum in Dallas, the Byler Museum in Basel, a lot more. But there's something about this first one that there's some unsureness that makes it makes it very human. So it's not a really perfected machine. That sometimes the light leaks through it, the ferro cement leaves, the way that it's attached to a space frame is not really perfect. There's something that's dark about the floor that's quite weathered in that makes it for me more human than the later ones when it was so perfected as a machine. Also, Peter Rice was involved in this period of Piano's project that makes it quite magical. Anyway, I'm digressing. So the building of Renzo's is on the upper left. This campus also contains Mark Rothko's chapel from 1971. Piano did a Cy Twombly gallery in the 90s. There's a Byzantine chapel. The last work of Dan Flavin was installed in an old market building. There's this big housing scheme that was there that's been demolished. So that's where our building was. So our analysis, of course, looked at the collection of buildings. We looked at the pre-war houses that the Menils bought and preserved, oftentimes painted this so-called Menil gray. And this is what was there, and then this is what we did. So before the Twombly Gallery was somehow enclosed. It only has a space to the right of it, but it's always the intention that it will be open. So when the housing was torn down, our building on the right, together with the energy building that we also designed on the left, work in concert with the Twombly Gallery to create a scale of rooms, outdoor space that didn't exist in the rest of the campus. Now, when you go there, the Rothko space was very defined, as an outdoor space. Everything else is quite open, like between these kind of single-family houses. And then there's a new sculpture park. So having this scale and this scale open space were important. So our courtyards that we've done, the whole idea was to preserve some of the trees, build courtyards around them, and you enter the building through these courtyards. So here you see these. This is a more recent photograph. These are the courtyards. The trees are more fully grown. So you can enter from the north the way that you normally do, or also this new way of entering from the south, which this building needed to face becomes a gateway of sorts through the sculpture park. So it's a smaller building than it looks because it stretches out. These courtyards are neither interior spaces nor exterior spaces. We see these courtyards as belonging to the sculpture park as well as belonging to the building. For drawings, which are very light sensitive, the gallery spaces are 50 lux, 5-foot candles. So the design is really about how do you adjust your eye from the outdoor strong sun of Texas, of Houston, and gradually going into the gallery space and don't feel like you're in a dark space. So this whole notion of not having a matinee effect, going to a dark theater, walking out completely bright-eyed, and how the architecture of the porch, the trees, work together to slowly, gradually let your eye adjust before you enter into the gallery space. Michael van Valkenburg was the landscape architect of very, very different characteristics on all three of the courtyards. Guy Nordenson was the structure engineer for this project. Guy and Brett Schneider. Guy opened the Arab office in New York. He worked closely with Peter Rice, and he talked about Peter Rice always wanted to have something human, something of a human touch into spaces. So when we did these steel panels, clearly in relationship to piano, we decided to choose a thinner steel plane so that the structure could telegraph through it. So in certain light you can see it's quite flat and abstract, but at certain raking light you can see the substructure. And this is something we learned. How do you have this abstraction but also introduce maybe surreptitiously another dimension of scale to the project? So in a way, it's an abstraction of a piece of paper or origami, like a halo surrounding the building. So you enter through the courtyard, you enter into a space, you're inside already, but you're very much aware of the outdoor space. You're seeing the energy house across the street. This is the living room. This is not in the program when we were commissioned, but we basically analyzed that they need a space like that like a shaker meeting room that's not programmed, but we didn't have to add square footage. We managed a way to take out some of the circulation space and collect it and form this room that the curators could use it for artwork that are less light sensitive, or they use it for fundraising galas or for film projection and such. So what was cantilever on the outside comes back and form a gable roof, and sometimes these details that recall the language of the surrounding vernacular houses that's adjacent to a much more functional type of gallery that sometimes have natural light that comes in laterally versus from above. But in this case, this Ronnie Horn show was closed. And then the more the courtyard that is for the scholars and for the office, very different plans and very different light. We're always looking at ecclesiastical or religious structures. It's not on the sleeve that when you go to the Menil campus, they're Catholic, but the Menils are Catholic, but there's something that is, you feel a non-denominational spirituality in some of the buildings. Of course, the chapels, the Menil collection has this nave-like space. The Dan Flavin has this kind of grotto aspect. So we are very much looking at monasteries. We're very much looking at cloisters of monasteries and how certain medieval monasteries, they have a courtyard only for the monks, and then there's a courtyard where the monks would interact with the world. So this type of private and public, but also visually connected space was important for us. That courtyard was next to the drawing room. Here's a room where the drawings would not be exposed for a long period of time, hence the natural light that rakes down the wall, and also the same type of light in the private spaces. Like this is the staff's meeting room next to the conservation room, and then it's the same type of roofing that we use for the living room, as well as having these type of intimate spaces, how the living room was used differently. An artist was commissioned to do a temporary wall drawing, and then the other courtyard is much more domestic in its landscape because it's adjacent to the single-family houses. Walking back out, it was in a music video, and then how it was constructed, how there were the panels were fabricated and then they're hoisted and lifted inside. And then not long after this building was finished, it was decided instead of new houses, single-family houses, a Michael Heiser piece on the right is being relocated there. So there's this desert piece that he was originally installed in the desert with these steel plates sunken into the ground is right adjacent to the building. So in many ways, I think this building is really built out of these courtyards. These courtyards that comes in from the natural space, that is an in-between zone between the interior and the exterior, between man-made, between nature. This is one of the last piece by Ellsworth Kelly called the Menil curve that he did to be placed in front of the wall, just to cast a shadow onto the wall. See how our roof relates to the Twombly Gallery, and then the tree. I always think of, like Louis Barragan talked about the white wall as a place where the shadow of a tree could take a rest. So I think to conclude, I think back about the urn and the chamber pot, and thinking about this difference, and this difference for us between art and architecture. Like, when is it art, when is it architecture, when is it container for art? What is the difference between a container for art versus a container for production of art versus a container for something else? And I'd just like to end with a quote, a famous quote by Adolf Loos, where he contemplated this difference, where he said, quote, "The house has to please everyone. To distinguish it from art that does not have to please anyone. Art is a private matter for the artist, not so with the house. The work of art is set forth in the world without any necessity for its being used for anything. The house serves a purpose. The artwork is not answerable to anyone. The house to everyone. The work is art. The work is art. The work of art wants to tear men from their comfort. The house has to serve their comfort. The artwork is revolutionary. The house is conservative. Has the house nothing to do with art? And is architecture not one of the arts? That is the truth." End quote. Thank you very much. Good timing?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. So we have time for a couple of questions. Public service announcement. We passed the mic, not because we want to hear you loudly, but because we also have some people virtually and for the recording. So we're mic using. I've got a warm-up question,
Okay.
And that has to do with representation.
Yeah.
Okay, so I see that some of your projects are representing themselves in a certain kind of way, right? Like they say, "Oh, here's the truth," but then they're almost like winking at us or begging the question that there might be some lies here, or some copies, or some self-references, or two different tectonics telling the same truth. And then you go and you look, and those potential lies, or that they've been set up for us, and then there's a meta-truth around it, right? Like it doesn't matter whether you've realized at UCLA that the surface is a surface, it's different from the columns, you're supposed to see that. And so then, when you represent projects, I have a lot of, I read them in that context, and then I don't know, when you're representing a potential work, whether we're reading what might actually manifest a kind of collage technique, or whether the representation is really kind of a step removed from what's going to be built, because the true representation is the existence of the thing. So on representation,
Yeah,
like basically, here's a crude way of saying that. Like, what if I now don't believe your renderings?
Right. Well, I mean, I think to answer your question, I think a great question. I mean, it's a loaded question. I'm just, for students, you might have heard that old adage that all architects are formalists. They just have different ways of lying about it. And there's a certain degree of truth to it, because I think architecture oftentimes one sees as a very autonomous or introverted activity, but in reality, it's not. In reality, so many things are being involved, so many people are involved. It's so expensive. It involves so much human resources. So, as an architect, as an orchestrator of all this, you have to understand what is everyone's story behind it. Certainly, if rubber on the road, what we do is we produce a set of working drawings. That's what we're paid for. Everything else is additive to it. Everything else. What we do is the set of drawings, a set of instructions. For the contractor, we do something else. We help procurement, we do construction administration, get the permits, we do all that. But at the end, that is the bulk of the work. So everything else that we add on to the top of it, whether it's representation for the conceptual phase, is a way to communicate to the different parties. And I don't think they're in contrast to everybody. So it's hard to go back to the truth and the lie part. But sometimes it's edited truths that certain parties needs to understand where their poetry is in the project. I just remember I remember my own education, and in my undergraduate years, I remember how Le Corbusier's Marseille block were explained to me in very different ways, from a poet, from a linguist to a developer, and all these stories are different. But then I realized that great buildings are really built out of these many stories. It's not just one way of looking at it.
Perfect answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful lecture, fantastic work. I love your work and share it with students all the time. So question on the chamber pot and the urn. I'm curious, having read an early interview with you and Sharon about interest in learning about construction returning to the US after practicing in Europe in the early part of your career. And I'm curious about the ways that, you definitely talked about construction here at times, and I'm curious if the urn and the chamber pot kind of metaphor analogy is somehow related to the kind of prosaic and I guess aspirational parts of that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. I haven't put it in this framework. I think one of the things is when I start looking at these projects in this framework, I begin to question some of the things. And I think that you might have read this interview that we talked about. When I first went to Switzerland, I remember seeing an architect showing his work was really built like a Swiss watch. And I know when I go back to LA, I would not have that type of budget. I would not have that type of skill. I would not have that possibility to build that. So you can do that, but it's basically like pushing water up the hill in that sense. It will never be as good as what's there because there are many factors that contributes to that type of construction. Culture, economy, land value, tax law, many things. But so I begin to try to understand what is the equivalence of the type of work that is in the context that we do, in Southern California, very different weather conditions. And we begin to look at like Frank Gehry's work, and why, and not necessarily the things that are published or the ones that draws most attention, but his earlier work, how he deals with the backside of buildings, not the ones that has Instagram, like and he has a way of doing it. I think he also knows, we learn from looking at his work, that he knows that there's certain things that he can't control. Like when you have, like the whole building could be like a grid, everything lines up, but the fire marshal can come and say, I'm gonna put the exit sign off by 5 inches. I don't care about your grid. It's absolutely, you can't control that. It's not in that culture, So Gehry preemptively made some mistakes, or seemingly mistakes that you can say more human, but then when the fire marshal thing happens, it works. It's like Richard Meyer, just everything has to line up, when two chairs are not parallel, you just try, for me it's the generosity of certain spaces versus the restrictiveness of the other. So I don't know if that analogy equates to, at the end, everything is just chamber pot for me. I have to figure out a way how to dignify a chamber pot, And maybe that notion of the turn of the century distinction between the two are not there anymore. How can we elevate the chamber pot or elevate something industrial that's into something at a higher level? I think we learned a lot also in our early projects where we have very limited budgets. I remember when we were told by a contractor that, if you have $250 a square foot, you can afford this hardware, you can afford this, you can afford this, you can afford that. If you have 350, you can afford this set. And Sharon and I realized very quickly that no matter how talented or driven you are, whatever you do, it will look like a $250 square foot building. And the only way to get out of that is to radically redistribute the construction costs as well as the design energy. So early on, at the outset, we say, okay, 10% of the building, this will be $1,000 a square foot. The rest, 90%, will be $200. But the trick for us, for us, is that the area that you spend $1,000 is invisible. Because, like, as opposed to the generation before us, you can see where you spend $1,000. But for us, that generation, what they do with this radical dynamic redistribution is that it makes the rest of the building look terrible. But if that moment where you spend the most money is invisible, it ingratiates the entire building. You know, so sometimes we did build adobe construction, thick 2-foot walls. When it comes together, when you think it's the heaviest corner, that's where we spend the money for the steel. You don't see the steel, but you see it's open. But then I forgot, by doing that, it creates something mysterious for the rest of the building. You know, so this is, I won't say it's a formula, but I think this was a way that we have been trying to say, we can't have an urn, how do we make the best out of the chamber pot? You know? Or make it an enigmatic chamber pot, I don't know.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jason.
Great stuff, as always. I want to extend this chamber pot thinking that you're doing here. Like, I lost count. I think you went over 100 projects. So some architects have less than 10. Does that play into the chamber pot? Like, are we spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to do 10 good urns when we could have been doing hundreds of pretty radical chamber pots?
Yeah, I think that's also great. I haven't thought about this in a while. I tell you, when Shannon and I started, we just saw it was coming out from a short recession. There are not a lot of opportunities. We saw a lot of colleagues coming out and fighting for everything, every small project. And when they do get that small project, they try to pile all the ideas up into that small project, you know. And sometimes the small project doesn't really were able to contain those ideas, and it did disservice to both the buildings and the ideas. So I think we were aware of that, and we were trying to say, let's just do one thing and try to do one thing well for each building, you know, in the beginning. And also, I think professionally, we try to say, let's try to take on as many as we can, knowing that not all of them will be great design projects. You know, so we said we learn the first 5 years, we learn lessons from every project. Maybe one is a design project, the other will learn how to deal with the city, with the permitting. The other will learn dealing with the relationship with the engineer. You know, so it was like also get us off the pedestal a bit, you know, get our hands dirty a bit more and do more things, knowing that not all of them would be great, but maybe then it prepares us for the moment when the opportunity is there and we want to be ready, you know. I think it's different. Everyone is different. I remember I interviewed Frank Gehry right after the Bilbao project, 1997. I was teaching at ETH. He came, ETH took the students to Bilbao. It was before his complete works came out. So I was writing an introduction of Gehry. And I said, okay, Gehry has won Pritzker Prize. He had won all these things. He has completed X amount of buildings to date. Couldn't find how many buildings. Look at books. And so I sent them a fax of this graph. And I said, 50, 60 buildings? Fax me back, big cross. 250 buildings completed. 250 buildings. How many of them were published, you know? Even when the complete works came out, a lot of them were suppressed. So I pulled out some books I had because a few weeks ago I was writing on Le Corbusier. I pulled out Le Corbusier's book. Le Corbusier had a 60-year career, plus or minus, and he did 70 buildings, exactly 70 built works, including the work when he did as Charles Jeanneret. But he also wrote 40 books. You know, he had 3 journals, when some films. So for me, and then about 150 200 projects unbuilt. I think Frank Lloyd Wright has 1,000. I'm just looking at quantitatively, you know. But that was his œuvre complète. That was his complete works, you know. Frank Gehry hasn't done a book at all, you know. But for Frank, he probably needed a lot of other buildings to get to the next building. You know, if you look at his career, maybe there are 10 important ones, but he needed all these in-between ones to get to the next one. But Corbusier, the quality is much higher. You know, maybe the least important building, you can write 5 books about it. But I think it's a pipe dream. I don't think, you know, you have to see what your circumstances are. For students, I think it's really important. You know, it's not just your will, but I think the circumstances that allow you to, you can do 70 great buildings. Great, good for you. But I think it's, I think to understand the circumstances is more important. I mean, when we play these games, it's parlor games. When I'm stuck in a plane or train with architects, we talked about these architects. And I said, well, is it more important to do one building and 10 or 100 mediocre buildings, or is it important to do 20 really good buildings? You know, and everyone has a different opinion. But I think you should understand the circumstances for students to help facilitate what is the best circumstances for you.
You might have to excuse us. A lot of us have a lot of buildings to go design. But in all seriousness, Mark, thank you for your generosity.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.